Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. In this week's episode, we're joined by Philip Tinari, the director and CEO of the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art, China's leading independent contemporary art institution. The idea for this episode was prompted from the remarkable expansion we've seen in museums and private foundations in China focused on contemporary art over the last few years. We want to get a pulse on the actual scene there from someone leading one of the country's most highly respected institutions. In our conversation, we'll explore the evolution of China's art ecosystem, the rise of private foundations, and UCCA's recent expansion to 4 locations. We'll also discuss the growing interest in global contemporary art among Chinese collectors, the challenges of navigating censorship, and what the future holds for art institutions in China. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Philip, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. So I think most of our listeners who have followed the Chinese art scene and its evolution over the last several years are familiar with UCCA to an extent, but tell us a little bit more about when UCCA was founded and what was the museum landscape in China like at that time and just how much has it evolved over the years?
So UCCA dates to this really beautiful moment in the history of China and the world in a sense. It opened in late 2007, which was just a few months before the 2008 Olympics here in Beijing. It was a time of optimism, of openness, of a certain cosmopolitanism. And, as you may remember, in terms of the art market, the great ascent of Chinese contemporary art. Our founder, Guy and Miriam, the late Miriam Ullens, were Belgian collectors of Chinese contemporary art, among other forms of art. They nurtured the place for the first years of its existence. Then in 2017, they sold it. UCCA it's a complicated question, but we're now owned by a range of different shareholders and patrons and investors, many of whom have been involved with us from day one or from very early on. And to your second part of your question, museums in China, when UCCA opened in 2007, it was like a spaceship had landed. No one had really seen a place with, flat floors and white walls and the full of, coherent visual identity and this ambition to be a kind of global contemporary art institution in the Chinese capital. I think we've fought to preserve and expand that mission in the 17 years since, but I don't think it's really changed in any significant way either.
Well, and it seems like so many museums and even foundations have been established in China over the last few years. Just how different is the landscape today?
Yeah, no, it's really an interesting question. So like I was saying, we opened in 2007. We can't claim to be the very first. That distinction, it's hard to pinpoint exactly who that would have been. But, like Today Art Museum existed in some form or another in 2003, and others that are no longer around. But the real boom of I never loved the term private museum because, we're privately held and privately funded. We don't take money from the government in any substantial way, but we're in every sense a public-facing institution with a real responsibility to our viewers and various stakeholders. All that said, this kind of emergence of contemporary art institutions in China, the first wave, started with UCCA, then you had Rockbund in 2010, you had Long Museum in 2013-14, in Shanghai, Used Museum at around the same time. And then, in the late 2010s, all kinds of places, Fosun, go to, and after 2020, places like the He Art Museum in the south of China. Now you have a place like Deji in Nanjing that just opened this People show. So there's this whole landscape of these contemporary art institutions that are privately held. I think that goes back to something really fundamental in China, which is the sort of delta between, what the government will actively do and what it will sort of passively allow or enable or permit. And contemporary art very much fits into the latter, with the exception of Shanghai, where you have a place like the Power Station of Art, which is the city government, and you have the West Bund Pompidou, which is the Xuhui district government, and you have Museum of Art Pudong, which is the Pudong government. Those are all massive contemporary art museums in Shanghai. But really, anywhere else in China, you're looking at privately founded, privately funded places to kind of form the core of this institutional ecology for contemporary art.
Well, looking at it from an art market perspective, I can't tell you how many times collectors complained over the last few years about losing out on allocations of an in-demand artist to a museum or foundation in China. And I do interestingly think it made some people curious about the quality of all these foundations. It just seemed like so many were popping up, and if you aren't there in China, it's difficult to discern which ones are doing a great job, which ones are just foundations being established to try to get access to works. What do you see as the driving factors behind this growth in foundations and museums, and how does the quality of the institutions vary?
So we're in this really interesting position. We're not a collecting institution. Obviously, our founder was a major collector, and people know the story of the Ullins collection being sort of scattered to the winds in different auctions that happened. The first one, even before I joined in 2011, and then subsequently. So we're sort of not burdened by that. But yes, like as you're saying, there are so many institutions. Some of them I'd even put in scare quotes, that I haven't just mentioned in China, which will sort of use this pretext of being an institution to get access to or preferential pricing for different works that they may be interested in, and that ends up in all kinds of different ways. I mean, for different people. One thing I will say is a lot of the private institutions elsewhere in China, whether it's Fosun in Shanghai, the oil tanks in Shanghai, Sifang in Nanjing, and a whole range of others, are founded by people who were involved with UCCA in the early years, people who were members of our Patrons Council. And I think that's kind of been one really interesting thing for us is, our donor group has been this almost like crash course in what it means to run or just be proximate to a museum, an art institution. In the same way that I think our staff is, our staff pool has become a source of talent for all kinds of different sectors of the art industry in China. So that's one of the things that really keeps me going. I've been doing this for 13 years, and this sense of continually kind of nurturing and building this ecology is so important.
So UCCA just opened its fourth location in China. I don't think everyone's aware of that. Can you share the vision behind this expansion, and how has each location really contributed to the museum's mission?
So it's, I like to call it a constellation, which is maybe slightly grandiose, but I think it's kind of a fun way to think of it, that we fit together like a group of stars. Beijing is our home. It's our flagship. It's by far the largest of these locations. It's the oldest. It has a storied history of, major exhibitions with, everyone from Xubing to Picasso and all places in between. It's situated in the 798 Art District, which is a converted zone of Bauhaus adjacent factories designed in the 1950s by East German architects, converted into art spaces in the early 2000s. So that's like our beating heart, and it's kind of where most of our staff are, and where the vision behind UCCA sort of takes its fullest form. We opened UCCA Dune in 2018 in October. That's situated in a place called Aranya, which you can Google. It's this vacation community in about 3 hours. Well, these days the trains are faster, about an hour and a half by train from Beijing. If you were born in Beijing, it's like where you saw the ocean for the first time. I'm from Philadelphia, so I always think of it as like the Jersey Shore of Beijing. You say the word Beidaihe, and the one, if you're like a China hand, you know it because that's where the Communist Party's senior leadership has their summer political retreat every year in August. Orania is in what I jokingly call subprime Beidaihe. So it's not near the, Ministry of Energy sanatorium or whatever it is. It's this new development, built out in the late 2010s. It's a 2 kilometer strip of coastline with all kinds of apartments. And the guy behind it brought in all sorts of interesting brands from Beijing, whether that's, boutiques or restaurants or a museum. And so UCCA Dune is situated in this award-winning building designed by Open Architects, which are a leading architecture firm here in China. Li Hu and Huang Wenjing were proteges of Stephen Hall, worked with him on a number of projects in China, and then went on to build a beautiful practice of their own. And the concept behind that building is that it's buried under a sand dune. So you enter through a tunnel, and the galleries are these sort of cave-like spaces that there's, like a Zaha Hadid building, not a single flat wall, except for one of the galleries. And you then emerge onto the beach. So it's a really special place. It's about 600, 700 square meters. It works well for a certain kind of curated group show. It also works well when an artist wants to take the whole place over and do something totally unique, whether that's Munir Al-Qadiri, Daniel Arsham, or right now we have a show by Heeman Chong, the Singaporean conceptual artist. In 2021, during the middle of the pandemic, great time to open an art museum. We opened in Shanghai a place called UCCA Edge. That's in an office building, which ironically is the upper floors are all occupied by failed vaccine maker AstraZeneca. In the middle of Shanghai, it's about 800 meters from the People's Square. We're on the podium levels of this newly constructed tower, which is also called Edge. One reason it's called Edge is because it's on the edge of the Suzhou Creek, which is this river that flows into the Huangpu River, which is the one from pictures of the Shanghai skyline, which was the sewer of Shanghai for many years, but was recently cleaned up and has become this beautiful kind of urban waterfront area. So our space there is, sits on top of the intersection of 2 subway lines. It's completely connected to the city, unlike in Beijing, where you only come to 798 if you're looking for art, or Beidaihe, where you only Orania Dune, where you go on vacation. This is a place that's connected to urban life. It's also, we operate this one in partnership with the owners of the building. And we're currently kind of adjusting the operational model. So we'll have some new shows. It's been a little bit on hibernation this year, and we'll be back with some new shows in 2025. And then the final piece of the puzzle for now is a building we call UCCA Clay, designed by the architect. UCCA Edge. The tower was there, but the internal conversion and all the museum architecture was done by Soil, the Brooklyn architects that you may be familiar with. And then finally, UCCA Clay, designed by Kengo Kuma, is situated in Yixing, which is a town about an hour from Shanghai by train, known for producing those kind of very brown, minimalist, unglazed teapots. They call it purple clay. It's a really special category of ceramics. And the museum is the centerpiece of something called, it sounds much catchier in Chinese. It was the #2 ceramics factory. So it was a state-owned industrial ceramics factory that was one of the cornerstones of the local economy, that very much like 798 has now been converted into a cultural creative zone. And this Kengo Kuma building, which is clad in these specially fired ceramic tiles, is modeled on what they call a dragon kiln, which is a specific form of kiln that dates back to, I believe, the Song Dynasty, that crawls up a hillside and the smoke kind of escapes, up the tunnel. So it's this wonderful building with great views from all sides, and which houses about 700, 800 square meters of exhibition space. The program there will be completely dedicated to exhibitions at the intersection of contemporary art and ceramics, which I think is really fun because it's a particular focus. At Dune, the focus kind of comes from the space. There's certain kinds of art you wouldn't put on a beach. There's certain kinds of exhibitions that work better in these cave-like spaces. Edge is more traditional. It's split over three levels, but we still find a way to have even shared shows like Warhol and Matisse and Liu Xiaodong between Edge and our Great Hall in Beijing, because they're roughly the same size. But Clay is going to be something completely different, with a particular focus. And I think moving forward, should we be lucky enough to open further locations, and at this point, these locations are all done as partnerships with in the case of Yixing, it's the local authorities. In the case of Dune, it's the developer behind Aranya. It could be, whoever is interested to bring, UCCA, its kind of expertise, its brand, its, position on contemporary art into their midst. They may invite us to come and, essentially operate these beautiful buildings. I think of it a lot as stewardship. I mean, it's audience building. It's kind of taking contemporary art to places that it hasn't really been in significant ways before, but it's also, these great buildings that are created are really nothing if they're not constantly filled with, exhibitions sort of worthy of the spaces. So that's definitely a piece of the puzzle for us as well.
Well, congrats again on the expansion. That's really exciting. So in recent years, there seems to be a growing number of new Chinese collectors buying contemporary art. From your perspective as a museum director, have you observed a noticeable increased interest in contemporary art in China? And has this trend influenced maybe how you program exhibitions or at least engage with your audiences?
Yeah, I mean, we're always working on many different levels at the same time. At the level you just mentioned of kind of collectors and patron type people, there's definitely been an expansion. I mean, you have extremely sophisticated collectors of global contemporary art all around China today, and that wasn't the case, 10 or in some ways even 5 years ago in quite the same way. So, our development program has kind of reaches people at every level, from our Young Associates program to the International Circle to the Foundation Council. That's fairly, akin to what you might see at an American museum. One thing that's, I think, really interesting, though, is just the level of, so-called ordinary viewers, the sorts of people who come and buy a ticket. Our ticket price is generally 100 RMB, which is like around $15. So it's, I would love to make it cheaper and hope we can someday if someone wants to sponsor, a free day or otherwise help with that. Great. But I don't think it's prohibitive. Of course, there are student discounts and memberships and all kinds of promotions and stuff as well. And I guess what I'm getting at is that I don't want to say the quality of the viewer, but the kind of acuity of the viewers has gone up so drastically. The sorts that for example, we just opened a major retrospective of the Belgian painter Luc Tuymans with 87 works, which is actually more than 100 canvases because there are lots of triptychs and other multi-panel works. It's actually larger than the Palazzo Grassi show. It's 56 lenders, 14 institutions, so on and so on. The kinds of viewers we're getting and the kinds of feedback we're seeing on, there's a Chinese social media channel that people outside China don't necessarily know called Red, which is this sort of Yelp, Instagram hybrid where people write notes and post pictures and videos, but also write a lot about how they feel about what they've seen, whether that's a ski resort or a restaurant or a bottle of wine or, an art exhibition. And so the kinds of comments we're getting, the kinds of debate that happen in these spaces is just so much more nuanced than it was years ago. And I think that just really speaks to the fact that the audience for contemporary art in any given country, but I think in China, it's particularly noticeable. It's a kind of lagging indicator of economic progress, right? So as much as there's a lot of doom and gloom around the Chinese economy, in the last 2 years and the post-pandemic recovery, what we're really seeing is the generation that came of age, was born in the 80s and afterwards and knew nothing but increasing prosperity through their whole childhood and young adulthood. Those are the people who are open to and engaged with contemporary art. And they're all now in their 20s, 30s, 40s. And that's actually the core of our audience. So our audience weirdly skews quite young. I think a lot of American museum directors would be envious. We're always thinking about how to get older people, people in their 60s, 70s engaged, but somehow that generation, which had a more direct lived experience of what I call high socialism and, the kind of vivid contrasts of the transitions that happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s even, is somehow less primed for contemporary art than younger folks. And there's just going to be more and more of them. And in cities, far beyond Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, out into the second, third, fourth, fifth tier cities. So this is, I think it's a really interesting moment in that sense.
I also wanted to ask you about censorship, which has often been a concern for contemporary art in China, and in particular for international artists exhibiting there. I know some artists, for example, who did exhibitions in China and they couldn't exhibit certain bodies of work from their oeuvre, for example. How significant do you think censorship is today, and how does it impact your programming at UCCA?
It's built in, right? It's kind of inescapable. I think one interesting thing is, like, when I first started this job, there were more gray areas. The first show I did was this artist Gu Dexin, who quit the art world in 2009, which was the 20th anniversary of 1989, and kind of has lived as not as a recluse, but he hasn't engaged in any way since then. That would be a very difficult show to do today for all kinds of reasons. And now it's become quite technical. I mean, when you do an exhibition, you upload your materials to this portal. If you're importing work, there's a whole separate process that has to do with the Ministry of Culture or the city level Bureau of Culture, that, the paperwork from that comes out, and then you can do the import or the temporary import of the works. And so that's when things get censored, edited, removed, whatever you want to call it. So there are things you cannot do. There are certain taboos. There's a certain level of unpredictability. There's intense frustration. I tend to be more focused on what you can do rather than what you can't, on the thought that, anything you can do is somehow building a conversation and creating a possibility. I find the most important thing is total transparency. So when we work with artists, like when we worked with Luc Tuymans, of course there were works, like somehow, Nazi related content is avoided here. It's not allowed in. The reasons behind censorship of certain themes and ideas, I mean, the obvious ones, that aren't allowed, but it varies, and it can be counterintuitive. And so there's just a lot of communication that's required. I never want to be the one doing it. I want to be the one to whom it's done. And so that always means presenting, things, the widest possible range of work, and letting them say no, rather than, kind of stepping back and saying, oh, we can't go there. And it's a very open dialogue in that way. I mean, I don't want to call censorship an open dialogue, but to say that, it's not as if, oh, I had something wrong on the checklist that I submitted, now we're in trouble. It's more like, here's what we're trying to do, and here's what ultimately we're allowed to do. And as frustrating as it can be, I think coming back to that, I ultimately believe in engagement and creating art experiences for people in the terms that on which they are possible, given the legal and other constraints of whatever sphere you happen to be working in. So that's sort of always been our approach to that, and it means that sometimes you go about preparing a show, and I have had a few instances where the entire show has been called off. I mean, one instance was the late great Heng Liu, who's a Chinese-born painter who made her whole career after the 1980s in the U.S., particularly in San Francisco, in the Bay Area. And, her work somehow, she was a product of the Cultural Revolution and painted in this very realistic style. I mean, it's a multi-layered, incredible practice. She was very early to a lot of things that painters are now exploring in this moment. But somehow that body of work just hit too close to home. And I've had this a couple of times where you get to the end of the process and they say, we can't give you the approval yet. We need to convene a panel of experts to discuss. And when you get that news, it's never good. And so in 2019, that was one sort of fully impossible show, which is a great regret, because she passed away in 2021, and it would have been incredible to be able to show her work here in China. She went on she had a great show at the National Portrait Gallery in DC the same year. And she had shown it in China many times in the past in kind of smaller galleries and other sorts of situations. But, we're so visible that it means that we're very closely watched, and we have to really do everything by the book to preserve, our possibility of existing into the future. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess again, like the most important thing is just to be very frank and very transparent about the constraints under which you work.
So looking ahead, what are a few things that excite you as you navigate the future of the institution?
No, so I mean, we had this really interesting moment in the, after we restructured in 2017, we were looking at different possibilities. We opened our first branch at June. We did this major show with the Musée National Picasso in Paris that was, predictably broke all of our records. It kind of got us a new level of renown. And so there was a period where we're doing a number of shows like that. We did what I thought was a really beautiful Andy Warhol show with the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh called Becoming Andy Warhol. That was kind of up to date on the latest Warhol scholarship and, considered his late and early work in interesting ways and looked at him as a filmmaker, photographer, all of that kind of stuff. We did a Matisse show last year with the Musée Matisse in Le Cateau-Cambrésis, which is his hometown in the far north of France. We did a show with the Museum Berggruen in Berlin, which is the collection of the late dealer Heinz Berggruen, which was another kind of greatest hits modernism show. And I guess at the end of that string of exhibitions, which I did not for economic reasons as much as because I didn't see those kinds of exhibitions happening anywhere else in China at the level that I would have liked. It kind of became clear to us that deep down, we're really a contemporary art institution. And so the program has kind of come back more in that direction. I mean, there's always been a commitment to showcasing emerging talents, whether it's the New Direction series that we did in the 2010s or artists like many that we put on show here, in our shows at Dune and elsewhere. But like, if you look at our major exhibitions for next year, we've got Annika E in March, which we've done in collaboration with the Liam in Seoul. And that will be, she's an artist, I think, whose work speaks to this moment and who's closely watched around the world, but has a real public here in China. And I'm just so excited to put her in front of viewers. It's going to open just before that sort of our Basel, Hong Kong moment. So hopefully a lot of international folks will pass through as well. In the summer, we're doing a major show based on a new commission, an immersive kind of work by the Swiss artist Pipilotti Rist. With all of these artists, I'm always looking for what is the connection to this context. And in her case, she showed in the Shanghai Biennale in 2002. And it was the first time I think many, many people had seen, a kind of video work that you could enter into and be, inhabit. And it's essentially what she's going to do now, more than 20 years later, but on just a much larger and hopefully incredibly beautiful scale. And then in the fall, in November, just after the Shanghai Art Week, we will do a major solo presentation of Yang Fudong, which is, the artist who's worked mostly in video his whole career. He was kind of first internationally shown in Oakway's Documenta in 2002 and in Venice in 2007 and so on. Showed with Mary Goodman for more than 20 years now. And that's kind of our wheelhouse, are these comprehensive presentations of Chinese artists. This one is interesting in that we're not going at it as a retrospective. We've done a lot of retrospectives lately. We did a Hiroshi Sugimoto retrospective. We did a Lawrence Weiner retrospective. We've got a Luc Tuymans retrospective. Yang Fudong's show is much more a single project or a series of projects around his hometown. Yang Fudong's interesting. Everyone thinks of him as a Shanghai artist because the images are sort of capturing this millennial glitz of Shanghai and its becoming, but he's actually from the suburbs of Beijing. And by suburbs, I mean the countryside just outside Beijing. And so this exhibition is called Xianghe, which is the name of the town he's from. And it will have a range of works, but the core one is kind of an homage to a very famous Chinese painting, but interpreted through this multi-screen journey that he's filmed in this town and actually filmed many years ago, and is just only finally editing. It's kind of a great unrealized project of his. So yeah, it's going to be a really wonderful year. A lot of Americans are not so excited to go to China right now, but for Europeans, it's basically visa-free since COVID ended. I mean, most of the, key European countries are now have these 15-day exemptions. And even for Americans, you can come here for up to a week and transit, as long as the place you've entered from and the place you're departing to are not the same. So it's not as difficult as people necessarily imagine. There's a lot on the docket, and there will be more.
Philip, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and updating us on everything happening at UCCA, as well as sharing your valuable perspective on the Chinese art scene. We really appreciate it. If our listeners want to learn more and follow along as to what's going on at UCCA, where can they find you?
Sure. The website is ucca.org.cn/en for the English side of the site, although that will be obvious when you get there. Our Instagram feed is pretty active and up to date, and that's at UCCA 798, which is the name of the district we're in. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, Philip. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.